Good afternoon. My name is Gary Evie. I have the honor of being the board chair of Mass Insight Education and Research. On behalf of the board and the staff of Mass Insight Education and Research, I want to welcome you to our panel discussion, From Turnaround to Excellence and Equity for All. Today's program marks the beginning of Mass Insight's year-long 25th anniversary celebration. Our 25th anniversary theme is Celebrate and Accelerate. And there's much to celebrate. Since our founding in 1997, we have worked at all levels of the education system, from the classroom to the Capitol, to improve the quality of education students receive. Over the last 2 years, our work has impacted over 5 million students in more than 9,000 schools nationwide. But as the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically revealed, all of us need to do more to ensure equitable outcomes for students. At Mass Insight, we are focusing our work with partners on accelerating student opportunity, accelerating the redesign of equitable educational systems, and accelerating the impact in equity-focused work. James Baldwin once said, "Those who say it can't be done are usually interrupted by others doing it." I'm proud to be part of an organization that is accelerating the hard work of improving schools at a pivot point in our nation's history. I'd like to thank all of our 25th anniversary partners for making our impact possible. And in particular, the State Street Foundation, the Butler's Whole Fund, the Lloyd G. Balfour Foundation, and Granite City Electric. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Mass Insight's CEO, Dr. Susan Lusi. Dr. Lusi.
Thank you so much, Gary. And I too want to thank our 25th anniversary sponsors for supporting Mass Insight. Mass Insight prides itself on partnering at the school, district, and state level to advance innovative, practical policies and practices to ensure that all students, and especially historically marginalized students, succeed. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us and remind you that this webinar is being recorded. Starting in the 1990s, states across the nation were adopting a standards-based model of education reform that linked assessment and accountability to overcoming the so-called achievement gap. This approach was codified by federal law in the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. For the first time, state education agencies could identify, through the use of test data, low-performing schools and develop interventions, what became known as turnaround strategies, to improve student outcomes based on test scores in the lowest performing schools. After several years of research in 2007, Mass Insight published the Turnaround Challenge. At that time, it was considered by some to be the Bible of school turnaround. The turnaround strategies advanced in the report informed accountability policies adopted by Congress and signed into law in 2009 by President Obama in the Race to the Top program. What's happened since? What have we learned from this work and the policies adopted by Congress and the states to help our most vulnerable students? For one, to state the obvious, this work is not easy. While federal and state turnaround efforts brought urgency, focus, and some short-term resources to the task, our capacity to improve low-performing schools at the time was limited and remains a challenge today. Second, the models that were adopted often did not foster the collaboration that we have learned is essential to building school cultures and practices that improve student learning. Real collaboration at the school or district level is also hard to do well. As our board chair, Gary Evie, said, at Mass Insight, we are using our anniversary to both celebrate and accelerate. In this program today, we want to celebrate the countless educators and providers, Mass Insight among them, who have worked together to dramatically improve low-performing schools. And we want to accelerate the field's learning on how to do this work better going forward, because creating the schools we need to serve all our children well remains an urgent and unfinished agenda. Our program today consists of 2 panel discussions with national education leaders representing the fields of research, practice, and advocacy. Following the second panel, we will open up 3 networking rooms for you to meet each other and talk to the panelists. Our panelists will share their insights about the legacy of turnaround and what we need to do now to advance equity and excellence in education. Let me welcome our first 2 panelists, Andy Calkins and Gary Henry. Their bios are included in your program book. Hey, Gary. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Sue.
Thank you both so much for joining us. I'm going to get right to it. And Andy, I'm going to start with you and ask, what are the origins of the turnaround challenge? And what were some of the key principles outlined in the report? And then I'm asking you a multi-part question. And how did the policies that were adopted through Race to the Top and state innovation zones differ from what you presented in the report with your co-authors?
So that's like a triple-decker sandwich.
I know. I'm sorry.
and force everyone else to eat all at once, but we will do our best. So
okay.
Thank you, Sue, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this. It's a big milestone moment. I can remember so clearly discussions back at Mass Insight in 2005 about what we saw as a slowly evolving train wreck that was very carefully laid out in NCLB and the legislation that showed all of the steps that underperforming schools would go through. And it was like watching a basketball go through a snake. You could just see this bulging mass of schools going, just barreling through the steps. And within a couple of years, we're going to emerge in level 5, I think it was, that was, the most serious category of failing school. And we observed there just wasn't sufficient urgency about figuring out what was going to happen with those schools. And so when your invitation came, that occasioned me to go back into the way back machine. So to answer your question artfully, I'm just going to take us into that machine. And if you can see this is from October 2007, which was like a month, I think, before we released the report. We were looking at all of those schools shortly to be named failing. And at the same time, Mass Insight had done about 4 or 5 years of research into what we called HPHP schools, high poverty, high performing, and there were huge gaps and, schools that were showing you could beat the odds. And it was right around then that Jeffrey Canada at Harlem Children's Zone made his now famous plea that, let's stop talking about helping schools beat the odds. Let's change the freaking odds. Let's change the odds. And so that was what sparked the 2-year effort to go into turnaround research and recommendation. And I won't take you through. It was really fun for me to just go back and dive into all this. Everyone who is here probably has this poster on their bedroom wall, I imagine. But this was sort of the centerpiece of the whole research and the set of recommendations. We divided what we learned from the HPHP models into readiness to learn, readiness to teach. These things were not brand new, but they were sort of new in the depth and comprehensiveness that we treated them in the report. What was newer was readiness to act. And I think in retrospect, that's really my answer to the third of your questions. What happened? Mm-hmm. Because, as we were already seeing in the ways that schools were being addressed as they went through levels, 2, 3, 4. It was mostly pretty timid responses. Let's improve this. The whole rhetoric was let's fix them, let's fix the schools, and that was not what they needed. And so, as the failing schools started to emerge, and as they began to get this barrage of federal money, we saw a lot of the same stuff. Some of it was due to policy short-sightedness. A lot of the energy was gathered around firing failing school principals and firing their school staffs, instead of the whole set of interventions that were pretty carefully thought through in Turnaround Challenge, and that involved a whole set of partners and changes summarized in this graphic that were very different from what emerged. We used to complain. I think there are some co-authors of the report in this webinar with me, and we used to sit there and say, it's going to be a problem if way too much federal money is spent way too quickly in this area, because we're not ready for it. And neither policymakers nor the partner community nor the field itself had gathered itself sufficiently around the need to do more than just fix, and so this set of predictions largely came true. They stayed true. There were insufficient incentives for people to change their behavior, insufficient comprehensiveness, intensity, sustainability, all of that, insufficient and insufficiently creative thinking from the state. And the irony there is that there were outliers. When we said it's about conditions, capacity, and clusters, people around here, I'm up in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Massachusetts points, with some justification at the improvements that happened in Lawrence, and what happened there, they changed the conditions with a state receivership and put in the right guy who did the change, Jeff Riley, in a sort of an enabling and inclusive way. And in capacity, there were other places like AUSL in Chicago that really focused on that. And there were other places like Tennessee where they did a lot of this sort of clustering. So, there were some good examples and some good work being done, but sadly, like so much that happens in public education, these remained in the category of beautiful exceptions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Gary, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to describe the key findings of your research on the implementation of turnaround models, and tell us, based on your research, under what conditions has turnaround worked and not worked?
Sure, Sue. First, I really wanted to take just a moment to congratulate you, all of your Mass Insight colleagues and alumni on their illustrious first 25 years. Hopefully there'll be 25 more that are just as influential on moving this ball in the United States. So there's a lot to congratulate. Secondly, I want to say I went back and reread most, but not all, Andy, of the Turnaround Challenge.
A lot.
It truly stands the test of time. The things that you pointed out there are really in large measure consistent with some of the best research that we find. So today I wanted to really emphasize some new things that we found that I think are trying to open up this black box for more people to peer inside and use our research methods to really do that. So we recently published a paper where we call it Peeking into the Black Box, and we were testing. So we know that the I zones that Andy was in part referring to in Tennessee had positive effects. They had positive and significant effects their first year, They had it through 3 years, and we've now published results over 6 years, and you see positive effects from a consistently run reform over 6 years. So what underlies that? So why did those positive effects occur? So we compared the I zones in a quantitative formal mediation study, and what we found about the I zones was that they hired and kept effective practices, effective principles, and the measure of effectiveness here was the principal's prior evaluation rating in the school where they had served. So they hired and kept effective principals, and they hired and retained effective teachers, and that's measured by the teachers' value-added scores. In contrast, the Achievement School District in Tennessee, their initial hiring of new teachers repeated itself year after year, and the teacher turnover really undermined or suppressed, in the language of this method, the positive effects. So Lam Pham, who's a co-author on the studies that I just mentioned, has been working on some new work, and it even goes further and illuminates a couple of the key points. So he looked not only at hiring effective teachers, but did the I-zone intervention itself improve peer collaboration, improve professional development, or improve the positive, orderly environment? So did the I-zone work directly on those, and those things that affected student achievement, or did they work through hiring the effective teachers? And what that report shows is that the I-zones themselves had a direct positive effect on peer collaboration. So that necessity, Sue, that you talked about of collaboration is out in the research that we have produced. Secondly, and I think this is as telling, the I-zone had a direct effect on improving professional development, but the professional development had no effect on student learning. Here's the third interesting finding. The I-zone, through hiring effective teachers, was able to establish a more positive, safe, and orderly environment in the schools, and that impacted student achievement. So hiring effective teachers had a direct effect through their teaching, but it had an indirect effect in that those teachers were allowed them to establish that positive climate and environment within those schools. So we really know the active ingredients. You create the capacity with high-performing teachers and principals, and that capacity becomes realized through changes, positive changes to the environment and the climate, and through peer collaboration. Now, what this speaks to, in my mind, is that prior to the work that you all have done and others have contributed to around the country, we had an interventionist mindset in K-12 education reform. We're going to tack this on to what we're already doing, and that's going to fix the problem. We know that doesn't work. So what I think has been truly important is switching to a systems mindset. And that is, so the easiest example of this is, I often talk about the importance of financial incentives. And people, as a part, one part, but a key part of the overall reform effort, the turnaround effort. So people come back and they try to pick that apart. Well, I saw a study of an intervention where they did financial incentives. That had no effect. I know of an example in a district next to us where they did it. It had no effect. But as a part of a system, it helps to produce the effect that you want to see. Standing alone, it doesn't. So that's the real issue with interventionist thinking, is you start to pick apart the good, thoughtful combination of those interventions that Andy was referring to, and through that you reduce the system to the easiest changes and minor changes that may not bring about the dramatic effects we want to see. So much more to say, but I think I've taken my time.
No, Gary, that's great. And to me, there are no single silver bullets. It's pulling many, many pieces together. I
Exactly.
have a final question that I'm going to ask each of you, and then I'm going to ask the first panelist on the next panel the same question. And Andy, I think I'll start with you. By any definition, improving schools is an unfinished and urgent agenda. As we emerge from the pandemic, what should we do to improve systems, schools, and student learning? And we do need to be brief. I'm terribly sorry. Whoop, Andy, you're on mute.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. The operative phrase in your sentence to me is "as we emerge from the pandemic,"
Okay.
because right now, so many more schools than was the case 2.5 years ago feel pretty broken right now.
Mhm.
Whole districts. And this winter that we're just coming out of with Omicron has in some ways been the worst time of all, and so I worry that in the broad justified concern around learning loss, and still sort of stuck in our let's fix the school mindset,
Mhm.
we're going to just channel whatever energy and federal money exists into fairly safe, same old, let's just do the same things, but, louder and longer to try to help kids make up their learning loss.
Mhm.
And nothing could be further from the reality of what school communities need right now. And so if I steal 40 more seconds just to
Yes.
take people into, all right. So this is a research project that we are going to be bringing out in 2 weeks, on March 1st. And it is a study of the schools and districts that were identified by these 9 organizations, including us, whose learning models match their organizational norms, meaning, during this pandemic, what a set of challenges. And so all of these schools out there are busy saying, we are all about helping kids develop as resilient, innovative, communicative, problem-solving, lifelong learners.
Mhm.
How is that going to happen if the adults and their working culture don't reflect the same attributes? And so these schools have committed themselves to all that. And at the bottom of everything they've done is this, what we call the grand agreement, where, across research, across the way schools are now defining success, across what districts value in the ways, in some places, they do the work, and what employers want. It's all the same. It's all the same. And so we think what needs to happen coming out of the pandemic is a reset around the point that Gary made about both capacity and how it matches with culture and climate in schools, because that's what has been lost. And that sense of belongingness and purpose is urgently crucial to anything else in the way of instructional and learning success coming after it. So that's where I would say we need to focus. And that's the lesson from studying all these schools.
Thank you.
That was more than 40 seconds, but thank you for your patience.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. Gary, same question for you.
Sure, Sue. In my view, the pandemic has increased both the intensity and the scope and scale of the work in front of us. We've got more schools in urgent need of turnaround and the kind of reform that we're talking about. And their needs are more intense than they were prior to the pandemic. I'm an eternal optimist. I wake up every day thinking that things are going to happen that are great for kids and teachers. We've got to be careful that the scope of the challenge doesn't overwhelm our capacity to improve. After showing a state board chairman that the efforts in their state actually had decreased student achievement gain and increased teacher turnover, the state board chair turned to me and said, I always thought doing something would be better than doing nothing. And that is not the case. We can make things worse unless we expand the vision to the systems of change that need to happen. I believe we can do it, but this is going to be a longer time period for the work, and it's going to have to be carefully monitored throughout with data going in to support that we're actually undergirding, because the challenge is intensely more difficult than it was 5 years ago. What the pandemic has wrought, we're not going to get through and over for several years. So I think we have to be careful, and we have to make sure that the work goes on, that we have the capacity to do the work right, that goes on in terms of these schools, or we suffer the possibility of making things worse for kids who have very little resilience left. We can help that resilience, but we've got to be careful making our choices.
I want to thank you both. I wish I had another day and a half to talk with you together. I want to remind our audience that Andy and Gary will be together in a breakout room following our second panel. So this is not the end of your opportunity to hear and interact with them. So I'm going to thank the two of you, and I'm going to welcome our second set of panelists. David Smith, Dr. David Smith, Kaya Henderson, I'm waiting as people, Dr. Andrés Alonso, and Tammy, I'm waiting. And Dr. Tammy Campbell. I want to thank you so much, and I'm going to get right to the conversation. David, I'm going to start with you and ask you the question I just asked our last two panelists. So again, by any definition, improving schools is an unfinished and urgent agenda. As we emerge from the pandemic, what should we do to improve systems, schools, and student learning?
Thank you, Sue. It's a pleasure to be with everybody. And I am grateful that I was able to hear Andy and Gary. And I think from that conversation, it's both uplifting and very frustrating, because I think the conditions that were present that prompted the report are still present today. So I guess let me begin this way. I think we need to seize the opportunity that the pandemic has brought in terms of the challenges. I think we have individuals on this call that could be incredible champions, and not just based upon their opinion, but based upon their research. Clearly, the pandemic has amplified challenges that we all face, and that's been widely acknowledged. I think one of the aspects of the pandemic is also it has removed the shroud of shame when it comes to mental health, and now we know how important that truly is. But when I think about advocacy, not everybody has fared the same way in the pandemic. Some of our students that have access to opportunity, even during the shutdown of the pandemic, still had access to opportunity. So it really has laid bare, I think, the issues of equity and equitable services to our students, because those that have higher needs, I think, have fared far worse than those that still had access to opportunities. So from a practitioner's point of view, I think basically where we need to be is here. I struggle with the notion that you can improve schools without improving the district. So I have always subscribed to the notion that you have to have district improvement aligned with school improvement. So many of our school-related issues and student issues are made worse because of district policies and practices. And I say that having been superintendent now for 11 years, 40 years in the district in which I serve. So first of all, when we think about district improvement, and aligned with school improvement, many of the things that we have challenges with are systems issues. I believe it was Gary that said we have an interventionist mindset and we need to have a systems mindset. I'm here to tell you that as educators, we are not trained to think of systems. We're trained to think in silos from early on. And I think that's one of the things that needs to be done from pre-service teachers all the way through. So we have to think of how our systems, how our structures and practices are actually counter productive when it comes to longevity of outstanding, the best and brightest teachers in our higher need schools. You know, we have an unstable environment because of the pandemic, as well as an unstable environment because of state and federal policies that we need to acknowledge and then put in place systems and structures that will help overcome those. So from hiring practices to compensation, I think many districts almost exercise a one size fits all approach, even though we know that our schools have many, many different needs. And then when I think about sustainability, I think about building capacity. That is so important. It's difficult for an individual school to build capacity. That's where I think the district office comes in, because I believe that our only role from the district office perspective is to serve our schools. So we have to make certain that we're building our capacity so that we can serve all of our schools at a higher level, so that when individuals come and go, that capacity remains. If you have a vendor or if you have a paid expert, whenever they leave, their expertise doesn't leave with them, but their expertise stays because of that capacity building and sustainability that you put in there. And I think this was addressed also by Gary and Andy, but maybe not in these words. When we think of an interventionist mindset, I think so many times we address symptoms and we never address root cause. So we have to get out of the business of simply addressing systems. It's not more math. It's not just better math. It is all of the conditions necessary, our systems and our practices, to make certain that we are actually addressing the root cause and not the symptoms. And then I think inevitably it deals with shifting mindsets. We have now a tremendous blame culture, I think, and it's everybody else's fault. We just need to simply accept responsibility and work together in that collaborative environment. And I think, once again, we do have a tremendous opportunity. While I think we mimic the funding that we received during the Great Recession, short-term funds, and this time a lot of them, we need to make certain that we leverage those ESSER funds to build a capacity for sustainability. And I could go on, but I'll cede my time to others and appreciate the thoughts that have been mentioned and look forward to listening to others.
Thank you so much, David. Tammy, I want to ask you two things. One, if there's anything you want to comment on based on what David said, and then I'm going to ask you a new question.
So I'll follow up briefly on David and really try to stay within the constraints of time. Gary said something that's so powerful. You know, I was in the superintendency 7 months ago. And so I was there when the pandemic started and through that year, and up until last spring, where we thought we were coming out of it, and that didn't happen. And all of a sudden we realized it's no such thing as coming out of it as moving into something new. And this notion around just doing anything, I believe there are some fundamental components that need to take place, because the students are different. Their families have watched their children learn in ways that they'd never learned before. And I think there's advocacy and a desire to have a role in what's happening in the classroom that we will not be able to sort of move back from. But I think fundamentally what we need to engage in, and as I listen to the report and having read reports like this as a superintendent, as I'm coaching superintendents across the country, we have to simplify this. People are fatigued. They've got a lot of things on their plates. And so the effective superintendents understand it's about revisioning again, and not just with your cabinet, but getting principals in, listening to student voice, talking to parents. We've got to go through a cycle of that again, and then imagine where we want to be. And then the step that's often missed is the theory of action. where your cabinet and your principals, this is how you get the systems. Folks need to understand the logic model back to the vision to students, and how are each of us going to contribute to the system so that these things happen. Then you should be articulating the components of school turnaround within that theory of action on PAC. And that's one of the things that I do is I work with leaders, and the visioning part is what gets people excited again. It gets them reimagining what's going to happen, and student voice, which I don't believe we've tapped into. I don't know if I've heard a lot about it today, but we've got to understand our students are not just here to bear witness to their education. They're here to co-author it. And we need them at the table as we're co-constructing what this new reality is going to look like. The other thing that I will say that I don't have an answer for, and it's one of the most uncertain times, because there are some conditions in some places that are just, when you talk about turnaround in and of itself, that's a whole nother conversation. I like to think about the words that we use, because I think when staff hear words like turnaround, they think that, okay, I'm turning around and I'm going to turn around again. We need to think about the packaging, even the words we use, about how do we reimagine? How do we co-construct a new reality or a new next step? So folks feel like they've got their foot in something that they can stand on and move forward, because many districts are having shortages of labor where the superintendents are subbing in classrooms. And when you come to them to talk about turnaround, they're like, what in the world am I going to do? I'm teaching right now.
So Tammy, you've raised so many valuable points, and I just want to ask you, because you raised the issue of student voice and of really raising the voices of multiple stakeholders, but particularly students. And I just want to ask you for maybe a couple of examples of the way you did that.
Sure, absolutely.
When you were in Federal Way. Yeah.
So I started out in year one with 75 scholars from across. I started calling them scholars instead of students, because words, we can speak their greatness into being. And so I had 75 students across the district who I met with once a month. We did things like school walkthroughs. They looked at student data. They looked at our strategic plan. They came up with ways to give awards to our teachers. Those 75 students then that's how we selected students to be on our school board from that pool, who are very diverse. They were diverse racially, they were diverse socioeconomically, they were diverse in ability, so that those scholars then started it all. We now in Federal Way, every principal has 35 students they meet with once a month. Those students do walkthroughs, instructional rounds with the principal. They look at data like our panorama data on belonging. They ask students, what do they think is at the root of this? They're a part of, quote unquote, our turnaround strategy. And the other component of student voice that we use whenever there's any major initiative, we convene during our all admin retreat before the launch of each school. We ask them, are you feeling the impact of what we say we're doing? And we get large groups of students in panels and fish bowls to tell us that. That's another component.
Thank you so much. Andrés, I'm going to turn to you in just a moment. I want to remind everyone in the audience, if you have questions for some or all of the panelists, please put them in the Q&A within the webinar. Andrés, I am sure you will use this question to also respond to other things you've heard, but let me just put the question out there. What does your experience tell us about what needs to be done collectively to improve schools? And how do issues such as governance, authority, capacity, credibility, and sustainability affect turnaround initiatives? Whoop, you're on mute.
No longer. If I knew the answer to that question, we would all be like incredibly lucky. One thing that struck me in rereading the report was the optimism and the tone of certainty, the authority of the report. And I think what we learned along the way was that there were many things that we were learning, discovering. We were pushing against the edges of our capacity and against no questions of politics, questions of resilient cultures, questions of systemic inequalities that we're really testing us along the way. And I think that the pandemic has exacerbated the fault lines and the failings that were there all along. And we're at a time where it's not just about schools. It's just so hard to get everybody to row in the same direction that it's made the job really, really hard for superintendents and boards. But it was hard all along. But anyway, getting back to your initial question, and I'm gonna try to be actionable and still hopeful and optimistic in what I say. First of all, I visited probably thousands of classrooms since I left the superintendency. And what is most striking to me is the variability that I see in schools, even within schools that are thought of as effective schools. We have a rhetoric about instruction and learning. And, I was struck by Andy's phrase about learning models matching organizational norms. But when you bring people to a room and ask them to basically tell you, what did you see around what's going on in a classroom, is remarkable how people who are often self-selected, people like go to Harvard to be superintendents, disagree wildly in terms of what is good around instruction. So, and NCLB was completely agnostic about what needed to be happening in the classroom. So I do think that we need to start in a way that it is actionable in every school and every district, regardless of what else is going on around them, around, people getting to some level of consensus or share understanding about what instruction they want, what learning they want to see, and why, and how does that then connect and cascade around all these other systems that we've just been talking about. And I'm sure that Kaya is going to talk a little bit about what that means in terms of poor students of color, especially Black kids. Because there is a real question about what should instruction be look like that has never been signed onto by everybody. If you walk into even the best schools in individual districts and see like this extraordinary variability in terms of the conception of the good, what people are doing, the tasks that the students are engaging in, what those tasks communicate about expectations, et cetera, et cetera. It is spectacularly variable out there because of norms of isolation in teaching and in schools. So how do you wrestle with that? And I think that that's a question that is independent of structures and independent of politics. It's just our responsibility as educators, okay? And of course, that entails a conversation with the community, because the community should be endorsing the learning that is going on in schools and not waiting for for test scores to basically render a judgment about what happens. So that's number one. So focus on instruction in terms around what is the good, what does it mean, and get everybody to have enough visual elements and enough clustering and communication elements that are in the report around schools and principals. You need the same thing around teachers, and it needs to be centered on somebody teaching and everybody else figuring out, is this consistent with our norms and what we want to see in a school? So that's number one. The second thing is that I think we need a shift in terms of the design paradigm that we're working under. And if you look at the report, and I was a superintendent when the report came out, and I embraced it. I didn't put the chart in my bedroom wall, but it was somewhere in my house for sure. Anyway, but the design paradigm is completely top down, number one. And it doesn't necessarily engage the implementers. And for 6 years I led the Public Education Leadership Project at Harvard. Kaya was a participant, and I was always struck by how smart the people in the room were when they were working. So were you. So was Providence, Sue. I think after you left.
Yeah.
I was always struck with me. These are the smartest people in the country. But then they go back to the districts and all these ideas, like why is there such a gap between their ambition and what actually happens along the way? And I think often it's because there's a granularity in that implementers, that the people down on the line are bringing to a set of questions that we often tend to dismiss as resistance. But it might be something else. And we just need to close the gap between the people who are pushing down on the plans and the people who are actually engaging in, okay, so what's this really going to mean? So that's number 2. Number 3, that our first 2 speakers talked about principles and leadership. And we need pipelines we need everyone to be working on pipelines of leadership as a core task of function of what's happening in school and districts, because what's happening around the naming of principals in most districts is completely accidental. You wait for applications, you partner with external partners, et cetera, instead of figuring out, if you have 12,000 teachers in my district, like 12,000 employees in my district, like I did in Baltimore in 2008, then why am I worrying about replacing 30 principals in 1 year? I have these 12,000 extraordinary people. Why haven't we done the work of identifying, of developing, as a purposeful thing, not as something that we're reacting to? So that's number 3, because since the 1970s and the effective schools literature, we have known that principals are the key to all this.
Right.
So, why don't we have the systems in place?
Right.
And that number 4.
Okay, so Andrés,
I'm going to be very quick, quick. I just have 4. So the principal question is a capacity challenge. The 4th challenge is a community and political challenge, which is why the report is full of good ideas. Why haven't they come to pass? Because there are all kinds of interactions around authority, around credibility, and around capacity that interact in such a way that the best laid plans of mice and men, right?
Right.
So leaders have to somehow engage communities in rethinking the boundaries of their work in order to gain authority, gain credibility, and obviously a lot of that happens from building capacity. In the absence, and I was also struck by this phrase around how the scope of the challenge is going to basically like overwhelm the capacity. Capacity has been a problem all along, and the failures in what we're trying to do in relationship to the challenges erode our credibility and our authority. And in the absence of credibility and authority, there's nothing that leaders can do, especially when they're subject to political winds that mean that, with changes in board, changes in policy, changes at the district, at the city level, everything can basically overturn over time. So there's part of the work which is around building authority, building capacity, and obviously always thinking in terms of the credibility of your value proposition. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so
Time
much.
is a huge variable as well. And I'll leave that to the panel.
And we don't have enough of it, for sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Kaya, you have a lot you could choose to build on here. And of course, I have a question for you. So you've worked both within public school systems and also as a partner to public school systems. And based on your experience, what should we be doing to reimagine schools
So first, I just want to say so many of the comments that my colleagues made were spot on. When I think about turning around what was the lowest performing urban school district in the country, which was DC Public Schools when I got there in 2007, to becoming the fastest improving urban school system, and remaining that way, at least according to the NAEP, systems thinking, capacity building. There were three big levers that we pulled to make that turnaround happen. The first was a deep, deep commitment to human capital, getting, growing, and keeping the best people. We built systems. This is the work of school districts, right? We have to be, Goodyear is good at making tires. We have to be good at making people better, little people and big people. Second thing that we did was a deep commitment to curriculum and upping the level of rigor. We talked a lot in the turnaround report about the changes that we needed to make for adults in buildings, changing expectations for teachers, for principals, whatever, but we didn't talk a lot about changing expectations for students, right? And so this curriculum piece is big. I'm going to come back to that. And the third thing that we did was deeply engage the community in everything that we did, in ways that Tammy talked about, from students to parents to community members to politicians, grass tops, grassroots, the whole enchilada. And what we learned from that is that lots of people do some of the things, as other colleagues have mentioned, but I want to lean in on three things, not four, just three, on three things that I think made a huge difference for us. So one, this orientation of co-creating with the community is huge. I would say all the time, these are not my schools, these are our schools. And so together, we're going to decide what success looks like. Together, we are going to make hard decisions like which schools we're going to close or how we're going to redistribute resources. And like, that's not, I don't call it community engagement, because community engagement is, I'm going to go tell the community what I'm about to do, and I can say I had the meeting and then I'm going to go do it. No, this means I'm going to put together a proposal for the schools that I think we should close based on the data that we have, but the community also has data, and we have to believe that that data, even if it's not on spreadsheets or on a PowerPoint, is valuable and important. And when you put these two pieces of data together, then you get to better solutions. You also get to more sustainable solutions. Part of the reason why the change has stuck in DC Public Schools is because it wasn't about a leader or a handful of principals. It is because parents, community members, students deeply own the decisions that we made together. And when a new leader came in and tried to change those things, the community said, oh, no, this is what we decided together, and held the reforms in place. So co-creating with the community, I mean, like Tammy, before I made any budgetary decisions for the year, I brought in students and asked, what do you want to see differently in schools, right? That is a very different orientation for budgeting than most school districts employ, right? And so centering the voice of students, allowing them to really partner with us, students, parents, community members, huge. My second point is really around redistributing the work in schools. I fundamentally believe that we just ask schools to do too much. Schools are the stage on which every problem in society shows up, and we're supposed to deal with it. We're not humanly resourced for it. We're not financially resourced for it. We don't have the time to do all of the things that people expect us to do. And so I think one of the things that we have to do as we reimagine schools is redistribute the work beyond schools, right? Beyond teachers. Teachers have an important role to play. I don't ever want anybody to say that I don't think teachers are important, but teachers are not the only people who can meet students' needs. They are particular for the instructional delivery that they do, but we have a lot of things that we're trying to meet, a lot of needs that we're trying to meet for students. And so we have partners who are able to do this in ways that could actually free up teachers to only do the things that they are really good at and really needed for. I look at how during the pandemic, the out of school time sector rose up and met the needs of students and families in ways that the institutions of schooling just could not get it together to do. And Like we're not bringing those partners to the table. We've relegated them once again to summer school or after school or whatever, when in fact, they could actually do some of the deep relationship building, do some of the social and emotional learning, do some of the environmental learning or financial literacy or sex ed or the 900 zillion other things that we want kids to be exposed to. And we could think about time on a different continuum, right? So maybe teachers are only teaching for 3 hours a day and partners are filling in with different content. The company that I run right now is called Reconstruction, and we teach Black history, Black culture, Black literature, etc. And we are partnering with school districts in very interesting ways to take some of the load off of schools so they don't have to do it all. The third thing that I would say is what you teach kids actually matters a lot. I said it earlier, but especially for kids of color. Sorry that the sun has decided to jump in. What you teach matters a lot. This rigor, changing expectations for kids and what they are learning, kids rise to the expectations that we set for them. And so when we set low expectations or mediocre expectations, that's what we get. When we give kids challenging work, kids are more interested in it. They are more willing to engage. Further, when kids see themselves in what they are learning, they attach and engage to the learning much more quickly. Academic progress happens much more quickly. Their commitment is leadership. I mean, all kinds of things happen. And so, I, in part because of the work that I do now, I'm leaning in deeply on the intentional development of identity and culture. It's really important. When I was at DCPS, to Andres's point about instructional variability, it was bananas. Everybody was doing their own thing. Everybody was teaching to the standards, but we did not have a universal curriculum, a district-wide curriculum. And so I moved very decisively to put a curriculum in place, kindergarten through 12th grade, aligned to the Common Core reading, writing, and math standards. And I called it my equity floor. This is the least that we are going to offer to every single kid, no matter whether they're in the wealthiest part of town or the poorest part of town. And it will be rigorous and it will be joyful. There will be windows and mirrors. Kids will see out into other communities, but they will also see themselves. And what happened was kids attached to learning in new ways because the things that we were doing with kids were worthy of their time and attention, and because they saw themselves deeply embedded in the work. And so we are now having conversations about what kids should be learning in schools in very weird ways. But I think we have to lean deeply in on curriculum. So community partnerships and curriculum, especially culturally relevant curriculum, are the things that I think are incredibly important as we reimagine schools post-pandemic.
Thank you so much. All right, now we have a real challenge. We are going to do a lightning round. Each of you gets to talk for 1 to 2 minutes to close us out. And it is, David, we'll start with you. But what closing thoughts would you like to share based on this conversation?
I think the answers are here. Is it a daunting challenge? Yes. Does it take everybody? Yes. But I think it goes from advocacy to making certain that the policymakers do understand that the policies that have been put in place are actually very detrimental. And I think stability is a key word that I've heard that really has been amplified a lot, but we tend to change our leaders like we change other things, and we shouldn't do that. If you have a good leader, make certain that they stay. But I think I am once again uplifted, and I'll come back to capacity building when we have the ESSER funds, and I'll do a little plug for Mass Insight unsolicited. One of the things that I love about Mass Insight is that it's not a canned approach. They listen to us, just exactly what everybody's saying we should do for our students and teachers. They listen to us and they help build our capacity so that we have that sustainable effort.
Thanks so much.
I don't know.
All right.
It just reinforces, I think, what we all know we should be doing.
Thank you. Tammy.
I will just
Lightning
say
round.
a lightning round isn't a fair way to answer your question. So I'm going to say some things that are probably not going to be completely stitched together. The pandemic, as much as it was hard, it also gave us opportunity. And I think we need to recognize that. Parents know more about how their children learn than they've ever done before. We always said we wanted parent engagement. Well, they're here now and they're tied in. So we need to build on that. Students know more about how they learn because some of them have been doing it for far too long in a remote environment. Quickly, we did a survey on belonging, and belonging for our students of color improved when they were not in school because they were not getting microaggressions and they were at home in places that were building them up. So I think that's another component. But I also think in addition to what's new, I always like to link the known to the new. And this idea of some of what we've always known still works. We need to imagine and vision together. We just need to co-construct it. And we need to engage our students, our teachers, our principals, and our community on what do we imagine. Whether you've got a strategic plan or that's done or not, the reimagining needs to be done. And then this articulated theory of action that accounts for the development of systems that are interwoven and using those kinds of strategies that are turnaround intermingled with that. And then at the end of the day, it still boils down to what the teacher is doing with that student in the presence of content. And I do believe whenever I've surveyed students and when I've done student stakeholder groups, the number one thing they tell me is that we want our curriculum we want to see ourselves. We want our curriculum to be relevant. And they tell us that right now what's happening is it's not even challenging. And so that notion of push has to be there and continue to do some of those other ideas around checking in, pulling your principals together. Where are you on these goals? How are you doing the PLC work, looking at data, including Scholar Voice as a component of that? Those are the things that are front of mind for me right now, that there are some new things, and then there are some things that still hold that we should be sticking with.
Thank you so much. Andres, and then Kaya's going to bring us home.
So number one, put a stake on the ground around what is good, what is the meaning of the good. Number two, make learning rigorous and fun. Number three, involve the community and move that definition of the good if you need to. Number four, identify great people. They are there. Number five, make hard decisions. And number six, don't let this opportunity go to waste.
Thank you. Kaya.
What is the question again? I'm trying not to just
The
respond.
question is just what closing thoughts would you like to share based on this
got it.
conversation?
Super. So I want to echo this. There's a tremendous opportunity, right? Where there's more money in schools now, the restraints are off, people are much more interested in addressing the whole child. And my biggest worry is that we are so fatigued that we will miss the opportunity. And so my closing thought is that we take care of our people. What I learned at DC Public Schools is you can get people to do really hard work. They will lean in, they will grind in, they will stick in, they will persevere, but we've got to treat them like people. We need to tell them, yes, we can. I think one of my biggest takeaways from a lot of the turnaround work that we've done over the last 20 years is these concepts of failure. Failure doesn't motivate people, right? People want to have a sense of possibility. And so let's stop talking about how bad everything is and let's start talking about what we can do when we do it together. And yep, it's going to take a long time and it's going to be messy. And I'm going to make sure that you get some time off when you need time off, and you're going to make sure, but we're going to grind this out for our kids. People, just like kids are willing to rise to a challenge that is worthy of them, our adults are as well. And we can make school districts fun. I ran into a former employee of mine in the grocery store the other day, and he said, "Do you know you made it fun to work at a school district?" Nobody ever. I think we have to bring, in the same way that we bring the rigor and joy to young people, we have to bring rigor and joy and caring to our adults. They are the only way that we get this stuff done. And, I think all of the negative talk about education in this country right now is only going to stop us from seizing this tremendous moment. And we've got to change that.
Agreed. I want to thank you all. And Kaya, what you said and what Andy said in the first panel and what others of you have said so many more years ago than I care to name. Early in my career, Deborah Meyer said something about, and I can't remember the exact words, but if you want inquiring, skilled, engaged, kind students, you need the same list of adjectives in the teachers. And I think we've heard a lot today about how do you create learning environments for kids, the kind you want for kids, and how do you mirror that for the adults. I want to thank you all. So there have been questions posed, and I'm going to pose one of them, but not to ask you to respond now, but instead when you get to the breakout rooms to start with it. And David and others, you referenced the federal funds and the resources that are currently in schools. And one of the questions that's come from the audience is, how can these federal funds be used for the type of work we've been talking about today? So I'm going to thank you all very much and express my deep appreciation. And I'm going to turn the program over to my friend and colleague, Rob Yench, to close us out and send us off to our breakout rooms. Rob, welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks everyone. What a fun and appropriate way to kick off our 25th anniversary celebration. We are an organization fundamentally about facilitating learning, and I have learned an incredible amount in the last hour. And there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm so grateful to all of you for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us. I think the arc of today's conversation perhaps has been, that we've learned a lot in the turnaround era, some things that we can continue to do, and some things that we need to change and evolve. I think another evolution has been the impact of the pandemic, and we've learned more about what students and families and schools need in order to serve students and families. And I think a few of those learning themes that have come through today that I'd just like to highlight, trying to just pick up on some themes here. One is around mindsets, and that we need to fundamentally check and examine constantly the mindsets that are driving school improvement. So a few things that have come up, Gary and Andy's panel talking about, even pre-turnaround challenge, Jeffrey Canada's idea that it's not about beating the odds, it's about changing the odds, and the need to shift from an interventionist to a systems mindset resonates. And another mindset that was surfaced in that panel is the idea that in the recovery from the pandemic, or in addressing learning loss, we need to somehow be louder and longer with the same things. Another mindset that seems to have come up is that, and Kaya just mentioned it, that failure doesn't motivate people. One of the things that Gary and Andy's panel highlighted was the need for more positive incentives, more celebration, more joy has been a theme here. And then another point that Kaya brought up is maybe the mindset around time and thinking about time on a continuum. Another mindset about thinking about what the role of a teacher is versus the role of other community partners and how we can bring others in. So I think there's a lot on mindset that seems to perpetuate the status quo and compound the revolving door of CSI, TSI, ATSI schools without kind of fundamentally examining and reshaping the system itself. So it's exciting to hear about ways that folks are rethinking approaches. I think another theme has been the importance of sort of every actor in the system. We talked a lot about the importance of retaining the very best teachers and leaders in the case of the I zones that Gary mentioned. And then, as Kaya talked about her capacity building strategies in DC, and as Andrés talked about, looking at 12,000 teachers and thinking, how are we developing these folks to fulfill critical leadership positions? And then the centrality of students and families in this work. As Tammy said, students are not just here to bear witness to their education, but to be co-authors of it. And we've heard some of the strategies that she used in Federal Way Public Schools to foster student voice in a very authentic way. So there's I think a real need to consider that we're all in this together, and that there are tons of actors, and that lots of folks need to get on the same page, and that sort of leads to this systems question. Is how do you get folks on the same page and rowing in the same direction, particularly when one of those entrenched mindsets is to think in silos, as we've been conditioned as educators to do. So I think, as David said, the challenges are clear. As others have said, I think it's an extremely exciting moment for us at Mass Insight, but also for all of us in the field of education. And as Kaya said, we need to navigate that with a real level of awareness about the fatigue that folks who are on the front lines of the work are experiencing. So really excited to continue the conversation in breakout rooms here. One question I guess that I'm left with is, and this goes back to Tammy's point about even thinking about the terms that we use, is whether school improvement is even the right framework. Is it about improving schools? Is it about improving the education system? Is it about improving learning? And what's the question that can drive that sort of exploration of our mindsets and collective work across many different stakeholders?